Hi, I'm John Ruther, owner of Northstar Motorsports in Chicago. We're known as the original racing resource. At Northstar, we sell a complete line of performance racing and safety equipment. One of the products that we sell are brake pads for race cars. I'd like to go over today some things about the type of brake pad that we sell. The company's called Pagid, P-A-G-I-D. Some people call it Pagid, but the Germans call it Pagid. They originally started out being manufactured only in Germany. Now they actually have a plant here in Detroit. So we get much quicker turnaround when we order pads than having to wait for the boat to get here from Germany. The thing I'd like to talk about, we have at Northstar a video series. For many of our products, we do product reviews, but today this is going to be kind of a technical video about brake pads and how do you break brake pads in. Before I get into that, I'd like to just talk a little about the Pagid brake pads and my experience with them. I've been using these pads in my racing for over 20 years, and during that time I never ever have had a brake failure or brake problem of any type. The pads work great. They last well, they can handle a huge amount of heat, and they stop like nothing I've ever used before. They're available in a whole host of different compounds depending on your need, the type of racing you're doing, and the type of brake system that's on your race car. We did a separate video reviewing all of those brake pad families and different compounds that are available. So check that out, and if you have any questions about the brake pad compounds that are available, just give us a call here at Northstar or check our website out. We have a full description of all of the brake pad compounds that are available on our site. The one thing I'd like to talk about in terms of brake pads before I get into how to break them in, the one thing that makes brake pads, and this pad in particular, very different from many other brands. This pad, the company has a patented technique which they use to mechanically fasten the compound material to the backing plate. And what they do is they actually weld brass studs through the backing plate, and it's mechanically anchored inside the compound material as well as being glued. There is absolutely no way this pad compound material can come off of the backing plate, unlike many other brands which are simply glued. And I've heard horror stories of the pad material coming away from the backing plate, and you end up with what I call catastrophic brake failure. It is not pretty. So that's one of the advantages, let alone the great performance from these pads that Pagid offers. Now when you get your brand new pads, you can see that they're all painted, and there's paint on the compound surfaces as well as the backing plate. Pagid kind of uses a color code for the type of pad. This happens to be an endurance pad. They're all the endurance pads are painted yellow. So what I'd like to talk about is if I get my brand new pads in the box, how do I break them in properly before I get to the racetrack or when I'm at the racetrack? We have some customers that like to drive their car both on the street and at the track with the same set of pads. Well, generally these are race pads, and that is really not recommended. I have customers that do it. And the key to doing that successfully is you first have to make sure you break the pads in properly on a racetrack if you're going to continue to drive it on the street. So when you do that, what I'd like to talk about are the techniques. And if you go to our website, there's a whole section on, we call it bedding in as opposed to breaking in, but it means the same thing. So there's a whole section on our website in the brake pad area talking about how do you bed in brake pads. And Pagid has a recommended procedure to use. The first part of it is what they call the break-in part. That's where you use low pedal effort on the brake pedal and keep the temperature down in the pads. So you use low effort and low temperature for a number of stops. And after that, then you get into the point where you slowly increase the temperature of the pad and of the rotor at the same time. I might say that Pagid recommends doing bedding in on their brake pads on a used rotor. They bed in much better because the rotor's already been bedded in by using them, and they've gone through several heat cycles up and down, and so that metal is now been bedded in properly. If you start with a brand new rotor that's brand new out of the box, I would break that rotor in with a used set of pads. Then later, when you go to change to another set of pads, your rotor's already got some miles on it and is a used rotor, has been gone through several heat cycles, then it's okay to put a new set of pads in and break those pads in. Then the last part of the bed-in procedure is what they call recovery stop. So after you've gotten the pad pretty hot, you want to actually start cooling that pad down by using lighter pedal pressure, trying to get the temperatures in the brake system to come back down. After the first session on the track, you may actually see the brake pads smoke. And part of the reason they're smoking is the paint that's on the pad surface itself is going to actually burn off. It's going to get hot enough. You can get brake temperatures up into the 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. So they get very, very hot. And all of this paint on here is just going to burn right off. And that may cause the pad to smoke a little bit. In the beginning, the first time you go through higher temperature use of the pad, you may even, the very first time, start seeing some brake fade out of the pads, and the pad itself is not fully bedded in until it goes through the increase in temperatures and then comes back down to ambient temperatures. Once you've done that, then the pad the next time will be absolutely ready to go and will be able to be used consistently on the racetrack. So what I would recommend, if you read the description of the break-in or bed-in procedure on our website, it goes through a whole series of so many stops from this speed to this speed, and then you wait so much time until you do it again, and so on. It's kind of complex, and unless you have a racetrack to yourself, it's very hard to accomplish on a track. What I do and what works exceptionally well is I actually bed my pads in a track environment, but I don't follow the exact procedure that Pagid recommends. What I will do, put a new set of pads in, take them out, and for the first couple of laps, I'll go very easy. I'll just try to get some heat into the pads, heat into the rotors very gradually. Build up that heat for 2 or 3 laps, so you're just using light brake pressure, getting the heat to come up very slowly. You don't want to spike the temperatures. That's when you can damage the brake pad. So after you've gotten them pretty nice and warm, then continue in that one session to use them harder and harder. So as you get closer to the end of the session, you're using them really aggressively. Like I said, you might even get a little brake fade because they're getting super hot. You might see them smoke a little bit. And then right at the end, you may want to do a couple of cool down laps to allow the brake pads to start cooling off. And then when you pull the car off the track, I might even suggest you drive it around the paddock a little bit to further let the pads cool down before you park the car. When you do park the car, be absolutely sure you don't stop the car with the brake pedal. If you do, you've then pushed the brake pad up against the rotor. And if the car sits there, that pad is smoking hot, you can warp the rotors. Same thing, don't ever set the handbrake. So the way I do it is when I bring a car in that's got really hot pads, I'll actually put the car in gear. I happen to have a manual gearbox in the car. Put the car in gear, and as I turn the ignition off, I let the clutch out in gear, and it'll actually stop the car. And that way the brake pad is kept away from the rotor, and you don't chance warping a rotor, because rotors are expensive and you don't want to warp one because it just feels awful and they don't work very well. So that's the technique I would use, and you can accomplish complete bedding on a pad in one session on a racetrack, and that's how I do it, and it works very well for me. One thing I will say is if you are going to put your pads on at home and you drive the car, say you're doing track events and you drive the car to and from the racetrack, it's okay to put the pad on, maybe drive it around for a day or 2 before you go to the track. Any more than that, you will glaze the pad And then the bed-in procedure becomes much more difficult because you've got this glazing on the compound surface. It's not rough like a normal compound would be. So what I would recommend in that situation is limit the amount of time you're going to drive it on the street before you get to the track and do a proper bed-in on the pads. But thereafter, if you're going to drive it on the street, after you've driven them for a weekend on a racetrack, after a little while, the pads are going to start squealing again. And the reason they're going to squeal is because these pads are designed to run at high temperatures. And what will happen is on the street, you use just real light brake pressure, generally speaking. So what will happen is you will then glaze the pad again. It won't be as bad as if you drove a brand new pad for, say, a month on the street and then try to take it to the racetrack. So what I would do in that case, when the pad starts squealing a little bit, and race pads by their very nature are going to squeal just because they're designed to run at a temperature that's 1100 degrees, 1200 degrees, and your brake temperatures on the street, if they get to 300, it'd be a lot. So what I would recommend you do is when they start squealing, take them out on a country road, aggressively use the pads a few times, and it'll get rid of that glazing that's on the pad, and then you'll be ready to go. So that's my tip on how to break in or bed in brand new race pads for your car that's track driven. And again, we have this whole article on both on our blog as well as on the brake pad section of our website. Our web address is northstarmotorsports.com. If you have any other questions or anything I talked about doesn't make sense to you and you want to discuss it, just give me a call at 800-356-2080. Again, thanks so much for watching.